In the studio of the talk show, there was a tense silence. The cameras were focused on Keanu Reeves, who sat across from the host, waiting for the questions. Everyone knew him as a star, but today he found himself in a new role, as a person whose words could shift the perspective on important cultural and political movements. The host, with a cold gaze, asked him directly, "Keanu, what do you think about the woke movement? Shouldn't public figures like you support these ideas?" His answer to this question was expected to be more than just a response. It was about to be a real turning point. The audience and the host anticipated a standard reply, but Keanu gave a completely different opinion, one that turned the conversation on its head. In the studio, where silence still reigned, the host sat, her tension mounting. The question about the woke movement, which she had posed, was a kind of test. She expected Keanu Reeves, known for his public persona, to give a standard answer that would neatly fit into the format of her show. She herself had always supported this ideology, and now she hoped to hear confirmation of her own beliefs. But instead, she felt her control over the conversation begin to slip. Keanu sat calmly, his face unchanged, but there was something in his eyes that made her uneasy. He did not follow her expectations. He spoke slowly but confidently. "Listen, it's not as simple as you think. I understand that justice is important, but we can't support any movement without understanding its true consequences." The host felt her own beliefs begin to waver. She hadn't expected his answer to be so thoughtful and mature. Now the host didn't know how to proceed. She was ready for a specific answer, but what Keanu said immediately changed the dynamic. She could feel how the audience was beginning to listen intently to every word. The host decided to counter, knowing that her beliefs in society had always been considered correct, but perhaps now she was losing control of the situation. She tried to impose her stance. "But if we don't support these movements, aren't we siding with the oppressors? Shouldn't we fight for equality?" At this point, Keanu looked into her eyes and said, "I'm not saying we shouldn't support equality, but what do we do when a movement starts dictating what we should think and feel? Where is the line when ideas become a dictatorship?" His voice was calm but firm. The host felt her own position beginning to weaken, and it seemed that the audience was beginning to question her too. The conversation was no longer following the script. The host paused for a moment, choosing her words carefully. She realized that this was no longer just a debate. It was an intellectual confrontation where Keanu wasn't simply answering questions, but actively questioning everything she and her audience had considered obvious. "But Keanu," she said, "isn't speaking your mind the thing that creates real change?" She tried to steer the conversation back on track. "Shouldn't censorship be the way to strengthen justice?" Keanu raised an eyebrow and said, "I'm not talking about censorship. I'm talking about how we all should be able to talk and exchange opinions without fear of being destroyed for it. That's real justice, where there is no place for the oppression of free thought." At this moment, her confidence in her words started to crumble. She realized that it was not just words, it was a real threat to her authority. The audience filled the room with a hushed whisper. Keanu continued, "Look, the world isn't black and white. We can't just follow something blindly without thinking, without questioning. It's important to see not only what we're told, but also what we feel, what's really happening around us. It's important to stay open and ask questions, even if it's not popular." The host, stunned, tried to maintain control. She began to defend herself. "But doesn't that mean we won't tackle real issues if we're constantly doubting? How can we move forward if we don't accept change?" Her voice grew louder. Keanu looked at her with calm understanding, but in his eyes was something she hadn't expected to see. He continued, "I'm not against change. I'm against those changes being dictated without considering everyone's views, without free discussion." Now, the host realized that she couldn't continue arguing along the same lines. This was no longer just an interview. It was a real battle for the right to free thought and individuality. But even after all that, she couldn't stop. She asked one last question. "So how do we solve all these problems?" Keanu waited a moment, letting his words sink into her heart. "We'll solve this if we start listening to each other. If we stop forcing one idea on everyone and open the world to different perspectives." At that moment, her face tightened and her eyes flashed with fire. She tried to steer the conversation back, but it was no longer easy. When Keanu spoke his final words, a silence fell over the studio. The audience was stunned by his bold statement. The host tried to gather her thoughts, but her gaze was clouded by the confidence with which Keanu had declared that freedom of thought was not just a slogan, but the foundation of everything. She pressed her lips together, trying to maintain her composure. A moment later, she jumped to her feet, as if she couldn't sit still anymore. The tension in the room reached its peak. "But doesn't that ignore the real issue?" she shouted, her voice almost frantic. "Are you saying that ignoring the needs of the oppressed and failing to stand up for their rights is acceptable?" The audience sat in anticipation, but Keanu calmly looked at her and continued. "No, I'm not saying we shouldn't help people who need it. I'm saying that we shouldn't achieve that by suppressing those who think differently. Helping others shouldn't mean closing our eyes to the importance of everyone's freedom, no matter their views." The audience felt Keanu's words resonate in their hearts. He wasn't just an actor. He was a person standing his ground. The host clenched her teeth, but there was confusion in her eyes. The host decided to regain control. She turned to the audience, shifting the focus back to social issues. "But not all ideas are the same, Keanu. Some ideas, like fighting for minority rights, cannot be questioned. We can't allow some to be oppressed for the sake of the balance you so strongly defend," she insisted, standing her ground. Keanu silently listened to her, his face calm despite her aggressive behavior. No matter how much she tried to portray his point of view as blind or irrational, he knew that continuing in the same way was not the path to the truth. "But here's the question," he said, speaking not just to her but to the audience. "If we live in a world where only one point of view can exist, it's not a society, it's a dictatorship. We can't make people think the way we want them to, even if we believe our path is the only right one." The host desperately tried to bring the conversation back to the original point. "Are you saying that any opinion has the right to exist, even if it offends other people?" Her voice was on the edge of panic. "That's exactly what I'm saying," Keanu replied, his voice steady. "Every opinion has the right to exist, as long as it doesn't infringe on the rights of others. And as a society, we should be able to discuss this without threats or violence." The nervousness in the studio was growing, and the host realized that her position was weakening. At that moment, a new person entered the studio, an expert invited specifically to discuss difficult topics. He was a well-known political figure with completely opposing views. "Maybe that's not the right approach, Keanu," said the new guest, setting the stage for conflict. "We need to not just protect the opinion, but fight for real change. We can't let everyone speak if their words hurt entire groups of people." Keanu smiled, feeling that his opinion was increasingly becoming the center of the discussion. But he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the expert, then at the host, and began with a touch of irony. "You want everyone who holds an opinion you don't agree with to remain silent?" he asked. "In that case, we all lose the ability to understand one another. And what if I say that the very changes you are defending should also be discussed, not dictated?" The audience perked up again, and the host noticeably paled. The expert fell silent, and Keanu continued. "Let's stop dividing people into right and wrong. Let's start learning to listen to each other." After these words, the host paused for a moment. It was clear in her eyes that she realized she was losing. Keanu could feel the dynamics in the studio shift. The host, who had initially thought she was in control, was now faced with the reality that her worldview was not the only one. "Keanu," she said, this time softer but with a hint of challenge in her voice. "You say we should listen. But what about those who refuse to listen, those who insist on their right to be above everyone else?" "Listen," Keanu said, turning to the audience. "No matter how much we disagree with each other, we all deserve to be heard. That's the only reason we can move forward as a society." The host sighed and looked at him, unable to continue the argument. The studio fell into tense silence. She could no longer continue the conversation in the same tone, and her words no longer carried the same confidence. Keanu looked at her and said without raising his voice, "I'm not against change, but the changes must be such that we can all accept and understand them. We cannot allow aggression and violence to become part of the process." The silence in the studio lasted for several seconds. The host remained silent, and Keanu, noticing her gaze, realized that she was finally starting to think about the words he had spoken. The audience began to applaud. Keanu knew that despite all the tension, he had remained true to his beliefs and had become an example for others. The opinion he presented might spark many debates, but for him, one thing mattered: speaking the truth, even if it wasn't popular. So, what's the next step? What happens if society decides that we can all talk and truly listen to each other? After the silence that enveloped the studio, the host took a moment to collect her thoughts. There was uncertainty in her eyes, but she continued to try to steer the conversation back on course. Keanu knew that her question remained unanswered, and all the attention was now focused solely on him. She decided to launch another attack. "Keanu, your statement about open dialogue and multiple viewpoints sounds appealing, but don't you think such conversations could lead to chaos? If everyone expresses their opinion without restrictions, how can we avoid opinions that threaten public order from becoming the basis for mass unrest?" she asked, trying to show that, in her view, freedom of speech could become dangerous. Keanu felt her question challenge him once again. But he wasn't about to back down. With confidence and determination, he answered, his voice calm but firm. "No one is suggesting that we let chaos reign. I'm talking about the freedom not to be censored or condemned for opinions that might not align with the mainstream. Society needs to be mature enough to understand that there will always be a diversity of views, and it's important not to suppress it, but to learn from it." Her gaze became more resolute, but Keanu knew that her words wouldn't easily steer the conversation back in her favor. He added, "It's not just about listening. It's about understanding that every person has something valuable to contribute, even if their opinion contradicts the accepted standards." The room fell silent, and the audience followed every word closely. Keanu was calm, but he understood that every answer he gave mattered. He felt that his words weren't just sounding off, they were starting to truly change the atmosphere. But the host, clearly frustrated, couldn't accept that she was losing control. At that moment, another participant was introduced into the studio, a well-known human rights activist who held more liberal views. He was invited to support her stance, and his sharp words were meant to put Keanu in an uncomfortable position. "Keanu, you say freedom of speech is important, but what about people's rights? Shouldn't we fight for the rights of minorities, protect those on the margins of society? If we give everyone the right to their opinion, won't it lead to threats to security and human rights?" The human rights activist interrupted, raising his hand to be heard. Keanu felt how this question had become not just personal for him, but a serious challenge for the entire studio. The audience waited to hear what he would say in response. Keanu wasn't against fighting for minority rights, but his perspective was focused on balance. "I support the fight for rights. I support those who need protection. But I also support the idea that we shouldn't make people silent if their opinion doesn't align with the mainstream, he said calmly, addressing not only the human rights activist, but the audience as well. What's more important, freedom of thought or the right to protection? Asked the human rights activist, trying to push the conversation to the edge. Keanu paused again, and his response became unexpected. What's more important, the right to be heard or the right to make others stay silent? We must fight for both sides. But let's not forget, everyone has the right to their opinion and the freedom to choose. We can all be strong without suppressing each other. This moment became a turning point. Keanu's answer sounded not only like a statement, but also like a challenge for the whole studio. After that, the words of the host and the human rights activist couldn't bring the conversation back to its usual course. Their questions became less certain, and the audience began to realize that the conversation was no longer following the standard discussion format and was turning into something bigger, a philosophical reflection on human rights, freedom of speech, and social justice. However, the host didn't give up. Do you really think that freedom of opinion is what we need in our society? We already see how hatred and xenophobia are growing on the internet, how hostility is spreading. Isn't this the result of allowing too much? She said, trying to regain control of the conversation. But who decides what can be said and what can't? Keanu responded, his gaze unyielding. If we start limiting freedom of thought, we are already walking down a dangerous path. History has shown that the greatest dangers to society occur when one idea begins to suppress others. The room froze again. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. The host was on the edge, and Keanu continued to stand his ground. The conversation had now become more than just a debate. It was a struggle over how society should respond to disagreements and what should be the foundation of true freedom. At that moment, one of the viewers in the studio stood up and addressed Keanu with a question. Keanu, you're talking about how important it is to be heard. But what about those who deliberately incite hate? Can we allow people who spread violence to speak openly? This question became a climactic moment for Keanu. He understood that, despite all his confidence, there were extremes that were hard to justify. But he knew that his stance couldn't be black and white. Hate and violence are not things that should be protected. But it's important for society to decide where to draw the line. I stand for freedom of thought, but I'm against violence and threats. It's crucial not to suppress people, but also to protect those who need protection. The answer was deep and sincere, and it impacted the audience. The room began to quietly discuss what was said, and although Keanu wasn't seeking approval, his words found resonance in the hearts of people. As the show came to an end, Keanu realized that, despite all the tension, this meeting had become an important milestone. He couldn't say for sure how it would affect his life, but he felt that, at the very least, his words would make people think. Today, it was important not just to be right, but to be honest, for myself and for others. This is a conversation that needs to continue, he said, summarizing. You've made us think, the host said, finally admitting that she couldn't counter his viewpoint. The show ended, but a certain ambiguity lingered in the air. Keanu knew that his fight for freedom of thought and respect for diverse opinions would continue. This was just the first step. After the show, Keanu left the studio, but the thoughts about what he had just said wouldn't leave him. The whole way from the studio to the parking lot felt like a fog. Passers-by and cars sped past, but all he heard was the echo of his own voice ringing in his ears. Do not suppress people, but protect those who need protection. He sat in his car, and his thoughts returned to the host. She tried to convince him that justice and fairness should be unquestionable, but he was sure that freedom of thought and speech should never be held hostage by political correctness. After driving a few blocks, he decided to step outside, feeling that he needed a walk to cool down. Keanu always believed that being on the streets helped him restore his mental balance. The city noise became easier to bear. He breathed in the night air, enjoying its freshness when he suddenly saw her. The same girl he had spoken with in the park. She was standing by a cafe, seemingly waiting for someone. Keanu stopped and noticed that she looked a little tense, as if she was going through something important. He didn't approach her immediately, but something in her behavior made him act. She looked up and saw him, her eyes immediately softening, and a slight smile appeared on her lips. "Keanu?" She stepped forward, still unsure, but her voice was warm. "Hi," he said, slightly surprised. "You're here?" She nodded, a little embarrassed. "Yes, I was in the studio listening to your words, and it changed me. It kind of shook me up. I don't know how to explain it." He felt her words touch him. He wanted to know more, to understand what she was feeling. "I'm glad my position gave you something to think about. Do you want to talk?" She looked at him and almost replied, but then her gaze fell on something behind him. Seeing his reaction, she abruptly fell silent. Keanu turned around and noticed a group of people walking toward them, one of whom was clearly headed his way. It was the human rights activist, the same one who had participated in the show. He approached closely and, without hiding his hostility, said, "We didn't finish our conversation, Keanu. You're forgetting how important it is to maintain balance in our society. Your freedom of speech shouldn't come first when it's about safety and truth." The girl standing next to Keanu felt the tension rise, but she stood there, her gaze fixed on the human rights activist. "Listen, are you always so critical of everyone who disagrees with you?" Her voice was sharp, but her words even surprised the human rights activist. Keanu felt the situation growing even more tense, but he knew that he had to be smart in these verbal clashes. "I agree that the truth is important," he said. "But let's not forget that no truth can exist without reflection and freedom of speech. We must respect everyone's opinion." The human rights activist clenched his fists, but chose not to continue the argument. "We'll see how you feel about it in the future," he said, walking away. Once he left, Keanu turned back to the girl. "Weren't you scared to talk to him like that?" Keanu asked, his gaze both surprised and admiring. She laughed, but it was clear that there was still a shadow of doubt on her face. "Honestly, I didn't think he would react so sharply, but everything I said is true. We can't keep having all our conversations on the same level. Otherwise, we'll all be afraid to say something wrong." Keanu felt her words resonate deeply in his heart. He fell silent, thinking. This girl, her words, her actions, all of it made him see the world in a new light. "You're right," he said, looking at her. "But if we're not open with each other, then what are we going to do?" They walked in silence, and soon they found themselves on a bridge. Keanu stopped, looking at the city lights reflected in the river. "Sometimes," he said, "I think we have to stop being afraid. There will always be many questions and uncertainties in life, but it's precisely that which makes us strong." The girl stopped beside him, her gaze soft. "You figured something out, Keanu," she said. "You've become a little different." In that moment, Keanu felt that he was starting to realize his role. All these words, all these conversations were not random. He understood that not everything had been said, and that this meeting was the beginning of something much bigger than just a discussion on politics and culture. Keanu felt his inner world shifting. However, now he had to make a choice. To continue down the path he had just begun to realize or return to the familiar role of a public figure, where he would once again be under the pressure of public opinion. A few days passed after the tense situation with the human rights activist. Keanu continued to think about what had happened and about how many people tried to impose their point of view based on common norms and trends. He realized that he had to be firm in his beliefs, despite societal pressure. Today, Keanu found himself once again in the spotlight. The evening was set for a large event, where many celebrities and public figures gathered to discuss crucial issues related to social justice. He had been invited as the main speaker, and despite his desire to remain in the background, he knew that he had to speak out and express his position. As he entered the hall, whispers and conversations immediately stirred around him. He noticed that most of the attendees were looking at him with anticipation. For everyone, he was not just an actor, but a person whose words could influence the opinions of many. On stage with him were other participants, well-known public figures, bloggers and activists who seemed to hold rather strong positions on political and social issues. One of them, known for his outspoken views, quickly noticed Keanu and immediately began the conversation. "Keanu, you probably know that this event is our chance to show the world how important it is to support the movements fighting for justice," he said, his gaze confident, though his voice carried a hint of irony. Keanu met his gaze, remaining calm. "I understand that justice is important," Keanu replied, his voice steady. "But how do you define justice? And what do you mean by necessary changes? We cannot walk down one path while ignoring everyone else. That's not right." The tone in the room immediately shifted. Some of the audience members exchanged glances, and several well-known public figures began nervously shifting their gazes from Keanu to each other. It was obvious that his words didn't fit into the standard rhetoric they usually promoted. One of the hosts, an activist known for his sharp statements, intervened. "But you can't just turn a blind eye to the problems that so many people are going through. We must act now, not keep discussing things," he said with a mocking tone. "You can't claim that all opinions are equally important when there's clear oppression." Keanu felt the internal tension building, but he knew he had to keep his composure. His gaze remained calm. "I'm not turning a blind eye to the issues," he said, his words firm and clear. "But you can't solve a problem by ignoring multiple viewpoints. We all need to respect everyone's right to their own opinion, and only through dialogue can we find a solution." A silence fell in the room. There was a pause on stage, and everyone was looking at Keanu, waiting for his next move. It was clear that many in the audience were surprised by his response. Even those who supported his viewpoint began to hesitate, wondering how Keanu would handle the remaining questions. When Keanu spoke again, his voice was more confident than ever. "Look, I'm not saying that we shouldn't fight against injustice. On the contrary, I believe that each of us should strive to make the world a better place. But the fight for justice should not boil down to fighting for the one correct viewpoint. Everyone has the right to make mistakes, and it's important to understand that there are no perfect solutions, and even the best of intentions can lead to dictatorship." The audience in the hall began to whisper, discussing his words. Some nodded, while others still looked at him with skepticism. That's when one of the popular hosts, known for his candid stance, couldn't hold back. "Keanu, you don't get it. You're so disconnected from reality that you don't see how important this moment is. Justice cannot be questioned. You need to be with us, or you'll risk losing people's trust." Keanu calmly looked at him and replied, "You want me to agree with you because it's easier than allowing others to express their thoughts. But I'm not here to be part of the mainstream. I'm here to stay true to myself, no matter what others think." The room fell silent again. Keanu could feel his words sinking into the minds of the audience. He realized that he was changing the atmosphere, making people think. As the evening came to an end, Keanu understood that this meeting had changed everything. He left with a sense of satisfaction, having expressed his point of view despite the pressure and criticism. However, his thoughts were still occupied with how important it was to maintain his inner compass in a world where every step could provoke a wave of condemnation. Meetings with people like today made him reflect. He didn't know how it would all end, but he was sure that his path was the right one. This was more than just words or support. It was the acceptance of oneself and the readiness to stand by his principles. When Keanu left the studio, he was faced with a barrage of questions from both journalists and people who happened to be nearby. But inside, he knew he had made his choice, And now, despite the pressure, he would continue to fight for freedom of thought and for everyone's right to be themselves. After the show, Keanu realized that this battle was not over. He remained in people's consciousness, and now new challenges awaited him. The questions he raised began to touch deeper issues than ever before, and now he needed to figure out how to proceed in a world that was increasingly relying on ideology rather than freedom of opinion. A few days after the show, Keanu found himself in the spotlight once again. His words had sparked numerous discussions, and many began to perceive him as a kind of voice of reason in a world where ideas often became victims of politics. But despite all the positive feedback, there were many who saw his position as a threat. That evening, at a popular cafe, Keanu faced a situation that unexpectedly changed his perspective. When he entered, he noticed that a few familiar faces approached him, people he had never met, but their expressions immediately raised his suspicions. One of them, a man in a sharp suit, introduced himself as an influential financier and public figure, and suggested that Keanu meet to discuss some business proposals. But Keanu immediately sensed that this was not just an ordinary meeting. "Keanu," he said with a smirk, "you did the right thing on the show, but I need you to understand that people like you may not realize how this affects public opinion. You don't want to be the one who disrupts the stability, do you?" Keanu looked at him in surprise, but at that moment his thoughts were elsewhere. His intuition told him that this wasn't just a conversation. The man continued, "You understand that views like yours can be dangerous, right? We just want you to think about what will happen to your career and life if you continue to speak out. Many people are already unhappy with what you've said. We can help you with this." Keanu felt his heart race. He was prepared for public criticism, but facing a real threat was unexpected. The man spoke so calmly, as if discussing something trivial that didn't matter. "Are you threatening me?" Keanu asked, his voice steady but tense. The man merely shrugged, his expression indifferent. "We're not threatening you, Keanu. We're just offering you the opportunity to make the right choice." Caught off guard by these words, Keanu felt his confidence begin to waver. Thoughts about what was happening raced through his mind. This was the moment when he realized that the words he had spoken had become something more than just a philosophical debate. They had become a threat to something much more significant, to the people who controlled many hidden processes. Keanu knew that this meeting was not a coincidence. He couldn't just forget what had happened in the studio. And while he needed to defend his position, he felt that his life and career could be at risk. A sense of anxiety rose within him. But then, as if by magic, everything suddenly became clear. He realized that, one way or another, he could not just back down. Keanu stood up and looked the man straight in the eyes. "I'm not afraid of your threats. I will stand my ground," he said calmly. "Oh, and if you think you can manipulate me, you're mistaken." But the man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he shook his head and smirked. "You still don't understand, Keanu," he said as Keanu was already heading for the door. "What you said will change your life forever, and not for the better." As Keanu left the cafe, his thoughts were overwhelming. He felt utterly exhausted and overloaded. He couldn't understand how people like that could affect his life, but now, realizing the danger, he knew that his actions moving forward would have serious consequences. The noise of the city seemed distant and irrelevant. All he knew was that he could no longer remain on the sidelines. His life, his career, his philosophy were now at a crossroads, and he had to choose, either continue standing firm and risk everything, or follow those who were trying to impose their rules and change his future. On one hand, he wanted to return to simplicity, to a life where he could just do what he loved. But on the other hand, his words were starting to change the world around him, and now it was more than just a personal struggle. A few days passed, and Keanu made a decision. He became even more determined in his actions. Despite the threats and pressure, he decided that he would remain true to himself and his beliefs. His encounter with those who tried to manipulate him showed him that it's important to always stay honest and not be afraid to speak his truth. And although his path was not easy, Keanu knew that he was making the right choice. In that moment, he realized that not only did he have the right to his opinion, but he also had the duty to share it with others.